Hello and welcome to NewsClick. Today we have with us Vijay Prashad, well-known writer and commentator on West Asia and of course a lot of the other part of the world. Vijay, Syria has seen some change recently. The rebel forces seem to have made some gains, taking over what is called a major dam, also attacking some of the military bases, taking over one air force base, it is said, near Damascus. But there is also another change that seems to have taken place. Al-Khatib, the head of the Syrian opposition, the official one now anointed by NATO and Qatar and others sitting in Doha, has said that they are willing to talk to the Syrian government and for the first time has not made the precondition that Assad has to go. Do you think that in the stalemate there is now a realization that militarily, whatever gains might or might not be made, a military resolution of the conflict is no longer possible?
I mean, those who have known what is going on in Syria, those who have understood the forces inside Syria, the kind of sources of Syrian state power, have known for a very long time that absent some kind of major Western military bombardment, a barrage of some kind, there was no chance for this rebellion to overrun the regime militarily, by itself. In Syria, the regime is far more integrated with the military and with the economic sector. One of my colleagues, Bassam Haddad, has written a book where he's demonstrated how this regime over the last 15 or so years has very craftily integrated the economic elites into a kind of neoliberal growth paradigm, but they are linked to the military. They are not outside. So if that is the case, if you have a very coherent power structure, it's hard to insinuate yourself, and crack that open. So unlike say in Libya or in fact even in Egypt, there's almost no major dissent among senior military personnel. There's also no major dissent among brigade level military people. That means that a military solution where you start seeing defections of battalions, brigade level defections, that has not happened over the course of 2 years. And I think the tragedy of the political leadership in the rebellion until recently has been that it expected a kind of Libyan a solution where somehow the West would say there are too many people dying here, we need to therefore intervene. But the Libyan solution was never going to happen in Syria for a host of reasons, not least of which is of course that Israel doesn't want to see the Libyan solution, not only the bombardment but the aftermath, which is the rise of what Israel sees as unmanageable Islamist groups.
Do you think that it's also something which has given the NATO forces a pause, that the kind of Islamic forces that has come out in Libya, of course which they themselves put in place, also the kind of forces that have come out in Mali now, and all this there is also in their calculation that pushing this further might mean a similar kind of situation in Syria in a long term, therefore a blowback for them as well?
I would say that there are at least 3 reasons that NATO has implicitly put forward, and this is from 2011. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the Secretary General of NATO, has from the beginning, from Ramzan of 2011, when the military period takes over inside Syria, he has consistently said we have no plan to intervene in Syria. And he said it quite unequivocally, there was no hesitation. He didn't say we will not intervene unless this is a red line. There were no red lines in his statement. And I think there are several reasons. One is certainly that the Israeli political and military leadership is very uneasy with developments in Syria. I mean, after all, people talk about the Camp David Accord in 1979, which took the Egyptian army offline as a threat to Israel. But as significant is the Syrian army. And actually the Syrian army has, without a public declaration, been offline as a threat to Israel since 1973. That's when basically tacitly the Golan question was settled, even though politically they keep saying we want the Golan Heights back. They've done nothing to actually get the Golan Heights back. They've been trying through backdoor for years to have a formal entente with Israel. So if on the one side Camp David is threatened and now the notional agreement from 73 is threatened, Israel's power projections are going to be upside down.
But Vijay, while there is obviously a good reason to accept what you are saying, they have recently struck what they call a research facility, saying that this is also being used to supply the Hezbollah and so on. Various noises have been made. So they have taken very provocative measures recently in Syria, which doesn't seem to go in line with what you are saying vis-a-vis how they look at the Syrian government.
You see, the interesting thing about Israel and Syria is this is not the first bombardment in Syria. I mean, Israel bombed in 2007 what it claims was a nuclear facility, and the Syrians didn't respond. I mean, in a sense, the Syrians have put themselves in a position vis-a-vis Israel where they'll take whatever Israel dishes out. They have never really responded. They barely responded diplomatically. There was barely any hue and cry. They didn't assemble an emergency session of the Arab League, talking about sovereignty being violated. All they did was deny that it was a nuclear or military site. So it's not a question of Israel doing a bombardment and that escalating questions with Syria. Syria has been on its knees. People have often said, but look, in Damascus, the radical Palestinians had their office, Hamas had their office, etc. One has to remember that in the 19th century, all European radicals, German radicals like Karl Marx had their office in London. That doesn't make England an anti-imperialist center. It just means that England cannily utilized these radicals for their own ends. So by the fact that Damascus was the address for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, it was the address for Hamas, doesn't make it somehow an anti-Israel state.
So what you're saying is Israel still would not like to see the fall of the Syrian government if it means that you get in place something like the Libyan coalition, which would mean the Islamists in power, which seems at the moment to be backed really by Qatar, Saudi Arabia and possibly Turkey. These are the three forces
Correct.
Still backing this kind of Islamist military solution. But the West's heart doesn't seem to be it anymore.
No, that's one reason. There are two other very quick reasons. The second is Iraq. There's barely a question of how to manage Iraq. After all, every time the Americans have asked the Iraqis to stop overflights of Iranian planes into Syria, the Iraqis have said, what overflights? The question of Iraq has got to remain on the table. People forget that a large part of the Syrian border is with Iraq. And the last thing you want to see is the mayhem to restart just when Iraq seems to be settling into some so-called manageable order. And very quickly, the third thing, which again doesn't get discussed much, but the Syrians have, unlike the Libyans, created quite a serious air defense system. Now, you can say, well, why didn't they fire against Israeli planes? Fair enough. But the Israeli planes didn't come near Damascus.
It's only 8 minutes from really the border of Lebanon, and Israel routinely overflies Lebanon, as you know.
Exactly.
And therefore, 8 minutes is a very short time for an air defense to really respond that quickly.
Right.
And therefore, I wouldn't say that it was a major failure of the air defense system, which other people are talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a wrong thing because they have a very serious air defense system of the major cities, of Latakia, of Dara, of Damascus. And it's not going to be as easy for NATO to take out that air defense system without some casualties. And NATO is averse to casualties. As you know, they prefer to go in and fight a war where they bomb from 30,000 feet and no NATO soldier is killed, and then they have proxies on the ground. That's their preferred mode. If they lose a plane, they don't like it. And I think they fear in their calculations that if they actually began an assault on Syria, they will lose some people, and that's just not tolerable.
So this is, as it looks like, Syria is bleeding. And obviously, number of people are dying on the ground. But militarily, a solution to that without a physical intervention doesn't look on the cards. Now, one of the arguments is tens of thousands are dying. What are the actual numbers in Syria of the casualties? Because this is something which has been very controversial, that how many people have actually died, how many people are dying. And routinely, we have seen inflation of the figures, as we did, for instance, in Libya, and of course, in a lot of other conflicts.
Well, right after John Kerry, talked to his Saudi counterpart, he announced that the death toll in Syria is 90,000 people. Now, this came in the same week as Navi Pillay of the UN Human Rights Council announced that the toll was somewhere between 60 and 70,000. You know, these numbers are interesting, and I'll come in a second to how they are generated. But I was struck by the fact that there's a 30,000 person gap between the UN number and the Saudi number. You know, it's essentially a Saudi number which the Americans are repeating.
But even the UN number has been open to question.
It's been open to question not by defenders of the Assad regime, interestingly, but the Syrian Human Rights Observatory, which is a key element, key institution of the Syrian opposition based in England, has suggested that this number is actually not credible, that it may be either lower or higher. We don't know. And the reason they've questioned the number is that they are not even based on estimates. These are based on press reports. Now, what does it mean to base something on a press report? Well, firstly, we should ask the question, who is doing this counting for the UN? They use an external, a private contractor called Benitech. Benitech is partly financed by the US Defense Department. That's not all its funding, but they do get US Department funding. Now, Benitech has said that they are not an evaluator of numbers. They don't evaluate if a number is good or bad. They simply go to the press, and the press says that in Dara 14 people have been killed. And so they take that and they say 14. Then they add 146 killed in Homs. They don't question the numbers. They don't go to mortuary things. And, you know, it's a silly thing to ask, why don't you get mortuary data? They're in the middle of a ghastly conflict. It's not possible to go to Homs and collect bodies and count them. So one should not be naive about it. On the other hand, the number is utterly based on reports. Now, what are the reports based on? So let's just take Jim Muir, for instance, the BBC correspondent who's reporting from Beirut. Jim Muir is not reporting from Homs, not from Damascus, not from Dara. What is Jim Muir doing? He's watching YouTube. He's watching videos made often by the rebels, where they will say in Homs today 146 people were killed. Now, it's likely 146 people were killed in Homs that day, but you can't verify that number. So what is happening is that the numbers are simply collations of what the rebels are saying on the one side, sometimes what the government says on the other, but these are not very good numbers. The problem is these inflated numbers, they are political numbers. These are not numbers that have to do with the actual toll on civilians. The real issue in Syria today, where numbers are actually known, is the question of refugees and the destruction of everyday life. That's the real number. The death count is used as a political football, and that's very unfortunate, because the more death, either it creates greater cynicism or it creates some energy towards an intervention which is not going to happen, and that will prolong this war. So it's a good sign that the opposition has said now, let's talk. The tragedy, of course, is that Assad has said let's talk a few times, but he's very rarely meant it. And one hopes that some spark of patriotism in Mr. Assad will be ignited, and they will start a political process to put an end not to the 90,000 dead, etc., but the millions of people whose lives have been destroyed in Syria.
The interesting part is, of course, is not very clear also how seriously Al-Khatib is also meaning this discussion, how much of it is a ploy, how much it is real, because he's quickly said that unless all the women prisoners are released, other prisoners released by such and such date, there are various conditions attached to it, like Assad's earlier offers also were. But getting away from that, do you think there's any chance for the UN envoy Lakhdar Brahmi to succeed, or in this context where both sides officially are saying they're willing to talk? Do you think there is any possibility of the UN envoy succeeding to bring them on the table?
You see, unfortunately, I'm a minority of one on this question because I have some faith in a certain kind of process which is not going to be allowed to go forward. You know, I thought at the time when the Egyptians convened a group where miraculously the Egyptians brought the Saudis, the Iranians and the Turks to sit around a table with Egypt. That was the Syria contact group. You know, if they had been allowed to oxygenate Mr. Brahmi's, agenda, there may have been some path forward. But unfortunately, the Americans and the Russians said that, why don't you guys all go home? We are going to take charge of it. And they took Brahimi to Spain. where they had a conclave, just the three of them. There was no Syrian around. There were no regional actors. You know, in some ways, we have to get to a point where the so-called superpowers realize that their fingers are not actually lifting anybody up. They're poking people's eyes out. And you have to allow regional actors to come and strengthen the envoy. And unless Brahimi is strengthened by the regional forces, as he was during the negotiations over Lebanon, you know, it was the regional actors that strengthened his position at the Taif Accords in '89. Unless the regional actors are heavily invested in the process, having the United States and Russia play the various, you know, their fantasies of a Cold War era once again on the body of Syria is not going to strengthen Brahimi at all. In fact, it's weakening him.
So, only possibility of peace is if the regional actors are allowed to play their part, and Turkey plays a bigger role not in fomenting strife but hopefully returning to the path of peace. Would you agree with that?
Well, you know, Turkey has its own problems, and in this, you know, we can have a whole 20-minute session on Turkey, the Kurds, and the very clever game that Assad played. You know, he played the Kurdish card, and Turkey suddenly had to say, bring us Patriot batteries, because actually we overextended our hand. We don't want the PKK to, you know, begin its rebellion again. And so I think Turkey was put in a back foot situation. But again, that would have been the perfect opportunity had the Syria contact group been given some space for Turkey to be once again engaged with the contact group, and for the four countries to send an envoy to Damascus to call for some of the opposition to come, bring Mr. Brahimi and pressure them to come to the table. You know, the United States is not interested in being at that conclave. They seem to be interested in bleeding Syria. The Russians are not serious about any kind of peace process. You know, they have a very antediluvian understanding of the politics of the region. A contemporary understanding would say, given the kind of processes opened up by the Arab Spring, given the fact that, you know, there is expectation and hope in the region, that if the actors come to the table, you know, they might be able to force a solution. You know, the fact that the Saudis and Iranians even agreed notionally to be on this together was a huge advance, and nothing was made of that, you know, by the international forces. Nobody said this is an opening. The Americans don't want this because they want to further isolate Iran, which works against Syria. And I think that is really, that's a death knell of the Syrian people.
So basically, we are still looking to a possible Taif Accords as a solution, but at the moment, things don't look very good. Thank you very much, Vijay, and we'll be watching Syria with NewsClick. Thank you.